there are still crazy things going on in Chernobyl to this day, decades after the explosion of the reactor at the nuclear power plant in April 1986. Now, animals and nature have rightfully been affected in a big way. According to a 2011 study in Biological Conservation, Chernobyl caused genetic mutations in plants and animals increased by a factor of 20. Among breeding birds in that region, rare species suffered disproportionate effects from the explosion's radiation compared to common species. Now, further research is needed to understand how the increased mutations affect species' reproductive rates, population size, genetic diversity, and other survival factors, but it definitely affected animals in a negative way. According to a study that began in 1991, the organisms responsible for decomposition and replenishing organic matter back into the ecosystem, such as insects, fungi, and microbes, are presenting symptoms of radioactive contamination, which isn't too shocking, but still isn't good. One of the most prominent areas of this effect has been called the Bloody Red Forest. It's a set of woodland where all the pine trees turned a blood red color right after the meltdown, and then died not long after. Now, it's pretty, don't get me wrong, but it's completely unnatural and has caused some issues. Now, 15 to 20 years after they were exposed to radiation and died, these trees were not decaying, when at this point, normal trees would be long gone. Due to this, scientists decided to run some tests by filling specially prepared garbage bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, making sure there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags out in both contaminated and uncontaminated wooded areas in the exclusion zone for nearly a year to check the decomposition rates of the leaves. Now, bags left in uncontaminated areas were as expected, with normal rates of decomposition between 70 to 90% of the leaves decomposing. But the leaves in contaminated areas retained 60% of their original weight, indicating much less activity by natural decomposers. Now, this suggests that the radiation exposure has a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients, which could be causing the stunting of tree growth that has been recorded. But with this comes another problem. The leaves in contaminated areas stayed intact and dry even after almost a year, and this could present a fire hazard, which in turn presents a danger of radioactive contaminants being spread outside the exclusion zone by forest fires. So that is scary and just not good at all. In 2016, a study found that the eastern tree frogs in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone exhibited different characteristics than their neighboring cousins, and in 2023, another study discovered distinct genetic differences between Chernobyl dogs and dogs living only 10 miles away in Chernobyl City. Now, not all the animals living around Chernobyl are entirely wild, as there are around 900 stray dogs, mostly descended from those left behind when people evacuated the area. Veterinarians, radiation experts, and volunteers from a group called the Dogs of Chernobyl captured the dogs, vaccinated them against diseases, and tagged them. Now, in addition to the tags, some dogs are fitted with radiation detector collars. Now, the dogs offer a way to map radiation across the Chernobyl exclusion zone and study the ongoing effects of the accident. While scientists generally can't get a close look at individual wild animals in the zone, they can monitor the dogs closely. And they are, of course, radioactive. Visitors to the area are advised to avoid petting the dogs to minimize radiation exposure, no matter how cute they are. Now, these dogs have increased rates of cataracts because the eyes are the first tissues to show signs of chronic exposure to ionizing radiation. Now, not all is lost on these dogs though, as the unique genetic diversity of these dogs makes them ideal candidates for future studies, seeking to understand the long-term genetic health effects of highly radioactive environments on populations of large mammals, especially in understanding the biological underpinnings of human survival in regions of high and continuous environmental assault, the researchers said. So, I guess that's a plus. Then there's the birds. While there are plenty of them in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, 489 different species to be exact, they are examples of animals that still face problems from radiation exposure. A study of barn swallows from 1991 to 2006 indicated birds in the exclusion zone displayed more abnormalities than birds from a controlled sample, including deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, bent tail feathers, and deformed air sacs. Now, birds in the zone had less reproductive success, US, and these birds often had smaller brains, malformed sperm, and cataracts, presumably as a result of radiation-related genetic mutations. Now, if you were already scared of spiders, these ones will freak you out even more. The spiders here are radioactive as they build their webs to catch their prey. They add to the dangerous environment of the forest. These webs are not like normal spider webs. In fact, they are woven in abstract ways that suggest genetic mutation is at hand. Now, they're also highly radioactive themselves, making them a danger for any non-radioactive animal to touch. Now, who knew spiders could get 100 times scarier? But that's not the only scary mutated animal there. According to Slate in the early 90s, which was just a few years after the incident, radiation levels in the wild boar that died near Chernobyl were more than 2,000 times what's considered safe. And even today, eating animals from inside the exclusion zone is still pretty hazardous, as a person might be exposed to radiation levels that are dozens of times higher than what's safe. Then in 2016, a video went viral of a catfish swimming around the cooling pond of the Chernobyl power plant. Very few mutations lead to extra large size, explains University of South Carolina radiation specialist Dr. Timothy Masu. Instead, they grow less efficiently, they're less capable of catching food, and they tend to not live as long. Now that's why it's shocking that it's so large, and I would not want to mess with a fish that big.
Moving on to a much smaller animal now, mice. These little critters are everywhere in Chernobyl, and they've become the focus for a lot of scientists studying radiation in the CEZ. They're usually used in experiments because they breed quickly and have relatively short lifespans, so it makes observing the effects easier, unfortunately for them. And in Chernobyl, mice have shown some pretty strange changes because of the radiation. For starters, their growth patterns are all over the place. Some mice have had stunted growth, others seem to grow abnormally large in certain areas of their bodies. Essentially, the radiation interferes with the mice's DNA, leading to all sorts of odd and sometimes sadly harmful physical changes. Researchers have also found that these mice have a higher rate of cancer and other diseases. The radiation messes with their cells, making it harder for their bodies to stay healthy. And what's really scary is that some of these issues are then passed down to their offspring, creating a sort of ongoing cycle of problems. But even still, they've managed to adapt in their own way. I mean, maybe they're not thriving as well as they would be if the area wasn't full of radioactive fallout, but they're still in an environment where humans aren't roaming around, so they're living. There's a lot of them, and their population just continues to grow. There are tons of birds in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone as well, but they also have a lot of defects. From 1991 to 2006, studies of barn swallows in the exclusion zone revealed some serious issues. A lot of them were found to have deformed beaks, albinistic feathers, meaning they were unusually pale or even white. Now, this not only makes them more visible to predators, but it can also affect their ability to regulate their body temperature. Tail feathers are another problem. Instead of being straight and sleek, many of these birds have bent or twisted tail feathers, which can affect their flying. And it's not just their appearance that's affected, their air sacs, which help them breathe, are often deformed as well. And birds in the exclusion zone seem to have fewer chicks that survive to adulthood compared to those in less contaminated areas. Studies have also shown that these birds often have smaller brains and malformed sperm. Bison. These impressive creatures have been roaming the exclusion zone for years. European bison are the largest land mammals in Europe, and they've had to adapt to a very different kind of wilderness in Chernobyl. But these animals seem to be flourishing even though they were exposed to high levels of radiation through the plants that they eat. Some of them have seen some strange health issues like your typical growths and tumors, deformities in their hooves, but the bison population in Chernobyl is pretty stable. It's almost like it's safer for these animals to be in a place with no people and higher amounts of radiation than in an area with little to no radiation and humans walking around and yelling and farting and leaving their Dorito bags everywhere. What would you choose if you were an animal? Higher radiation, no people, more people, no radiation. The lynx population has exploded in Chernobyl. Or maybe it makes more sense to say that it just formed. See, before the disaster, it was very rare to see lynx in the area. As stated by biologist Valery Yurko, lynx would show up sometimes, but because the area was so densely populated, they would never stay. In the years since the disaster in '86, elk and boar populations have grown. There are way more deer than there were before, so with all this food to hunt and no human interference, more predatory animals like the lynx have moved into Chernobyl Chernobyl and the areas surrounding it. And they hunt differently too. They're a lot more opportunistic and bold because they're not worrying about hunting animals like ducks that hang out in more open areas because they just aren't concerned about being spotted and hunted by people. Typically, lynx would hunt in more forested areas where the trees offer some protection, and that's just not the case when it comes to Chernobyl. Along with lynx, brown bears have also started moving into the exclusion zone, which they hadn't called home for over a century. So what's going on with these bears? Well, they're big, they're hungry, which means they need a lot of food. The exclusion zone, with its overgrown vegetation and all the wildlife, just makes for plenty of foraging opportunities. Bears are opportunistic feeders, so they take advantage of the environment, eating everything from berries to small animals, and even with the radiation, bears seem to be adapting well. They've been spotted roaming across the zone, forming territories and hunting in the area. Finally though, how could we not talk about all the green stuff? The flora. It's doing great for the most part. Nowhere is this more immediately noticeable than in Pripyat, the ghost town now being completely overtaken by nature. In the years since the disaster, the area around Chernobyl has transformed into a very unique kind of wilderness. The plants have been free to grow as much as they want with no human interference, and it's created all these new habitats for animals. Trees, bushes, vines, weeds, it's all spreading across the streets. It's growing over buildings and the insides of the old apartments. Nature is taking over every nook and cranny of the city, and that's pretty cool. The way wildlife has adapted and thrived after something as disastrous as this really goes to show how resilient nature is. A recent study has looked into the wolves of Chernobyl, and there were some very interesting finds, like the possibility that they've developed resistances to cancer. Now, this sounds pretty nuts because you'd think it would be the exact opposite. I mean, with all the cancer-causing radiation, you'd think the wolves would be suffering from cancer, not becoming immune to it. But Dr. Kara Love, an evolutionary biologist and ecotoxicologist at Princeton University, has found quite the opposite. She, along with a team of researchers, headed to Chernobyl in 2014 and placed radio collars on a number of wolves to track their movements. The collars gave the team real-time measurements of where the wolves were and how much radiation they were being exposed to. They also took samples of their BLOOD to analyze, and the study found that the wolves were being exposed to 6 times the daily legal safety limit of radiation per day. The wolves seem to have altered immune systems similar to people undergoing radiation therapy for cancer, and there were parts of their genes that seemed to have built a resistance to this increased cancer risk. Now, unfortunately, the past few years haven't really been ideal for continuing these studies for obvious reasons, but hopefully they can start diving into this more soon because the research could assist in cancer treatment for humans, which would be amazing. This is Jeremy Wade, host of Animal Planet's River Monsters, and he's holding a really big catfish, which he caught in the Chernobyl power plant cooling pond, which is home to massive-sized catfish, which have become a bit of a tourist attraction. Wade stated that this particular fish here was 16 times more radioactive than normal, but as big as these catfish are, their size may not actually have to do with the radiation at all. Now, while there may be mutations and defects in some of these catfish, the larger than average size is more to do with the fact that they're at the top of the food chain here. There's just no fish hunting them, and with no competition for food and plenty of it to eat, they grow pretty big. Plus, people have been flocking to the area to feed them, so that definitely helps as well. And they're reproducing at high rates and living nice long lives from the looks of it. But hey, they're still radioactive, so even though they do seem perfect for a nice seafood fry-up, that is still highly advised against. Once on the verge of extinction, a wild species of horse native to Asia called the Taki horse are now thriving in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. 30 of these horses were reintroduced to the area in 1998, and they've adapted remarkably well to their new environment. In the early days, scientists were a bit concerned about how these horses would cope in such a harsh, contaminated environment, but over time it became clear that they were managing to survive, but not without without some consequences.
Then, as of 2015, there had been almost 20,000 cases of thyroid cancer reported in people who were exposed at the time of the incident. And approximately 5,000 of these thyroid cancers are likely attributed to them drinking fresh milk containing radioactive iodine from cows that had eaten contaminated grass in the first few weeks following the incident. Yep, you heard that right. The cows created radioactive milk. Now, in 2018, it was said that Ukraine still has radioactivity levels up to 5 times the official safe limit, research suggests. Now, scientists sampled cow's milk from private farms and homes in the Ravine region, about 125 miles away from the site of the catastrophic explosion. Researchers found levels of radioactive caesium in milk above Ukraine's safe limit for adults of 100 becquerel per liter at 6 of 14 settlements studied. Now, the highest levels found were about 500 BQ liter, 5 times over the limit for adults, and more than 12 times that for the young. The study was carried out at the University of Exeter and the Ukrainian Institute of Agricultural Radiology. More than 30 years after the Chernobyl disaster, people are still routinely exposed to radioactive caesium when consuming locally produced staple foods, including milk, in Chernobyl-affected areas in Ukraine, said Dr. Irina Lebunska of University of Exeter. Though the level of soil contamination in the studied areas is not extremely high, radioactive caesium continues to accumulate in milk and other foods. Now, this is just one of the lasting effects, which is horrific. On a lighter note though, an endangered wild horse is making a comeback thanks to Chernobyl. The Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute called the Przewalski's horses the last truly wild horse. Its once large population that ranged across large areas of Asia and Europe was eventually reduced to almost nothing. When Lee Boyd and Catherine A. Hope edited a book about the animal in 1994, the most recent wild sighting had occurred in the late 60s, leading the authors to declare them extinct in the wild. But British ecologists Mike Wood and Nick Beresford, who specialize in studying the effects of radiation on Chernobyl's wildlife, observed that the Przewalski's horses is thriving within the exclusion zone. In the late 1990s, about 30 of these horses were released in the Ukrainian side of the zone, and the population has increased to more than 200. Based on camera trap images, Wood estimated that some of the original horses, identified by their brand markings, are still alive, and photos of juvenile horses also indicate that the population is expanding. And finally, if you didn't know, Earth has both a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protects us from dangerous radiation. Now, NASA knows that astronauts on the International Space Station get exposed to 20 times the radiation we get down here on the planet. So after discovering that a fungus thriving around the heavily radiated Chernobyl disaster site consumes radiation through radiosynthesis, they decided to experiment with it in space, and over the course of a month they found out that the fungus actually blocks radiation literally by eating it. The experiments on the ISS revealed that it was utilizing melanin to transform radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy. Now, this is actually really exciting because this ability may turn out to be useful in future space exploration. NASA is hoping that the fungus may be used to both shield equipment and the crew from deadly radiation during long space flights, and even more importantly, help clean up radioactive waste.